David, sadly, we mourn the loss of the great Charlie Kirk this weekend. I think that the Spectator reran an article that Charlie wrote in May during his right after his visit to the UK. The title was called "A Revolution is Coming to the UK," and the general premise was quite often the United Kingdom or Great Britain leads the cultural shift, and then America follows quite often. And the argument a few years ago was very much that England was going woke, becoming more left leaning, more liberal. You saw the Conservative Party, the so-called Conservative Party, really govern.
Oh, naughty, naughty,
Yeah,
naughty. Yes.
essentially governing from the center left, and so I think he has a point though that this MAGA revolution, this common sense revolution, is coming to the UK. Do you think that's right?
Yes, I mean, I certainly think that what's happened over the course, I would put it since 2020, I think the peak woke, peaks, I would call it peak silly, peak left, is of course the reaction to another great American death, the death of George Floyd, this fentanyl-soaked addict, who is, of course, a death in a very typical situation with American police, with a notoriously armed and aggressive police force, and equally, of course, bringing to the surface all the accumulated poison of American race relations, going back to the extraordinary compromises that a country which proclaimed itself as being founded on equality, of course, has the most, as it were, logically structured, in the sense of constitutionally entrenched approach to slavery and to racial inequality, and that incredible tension from the beginning there. So I think looking at peak woke in 2020, now peak woke in 2020, of course, is also me. I wasn't Chauvin, but I was, as you know, I was cancelled for refusing to believe that Black Lives Matter was a fundamentally moral movement. I was cancelled because I refused to believe at that point that the slavery was the new genocide. If you remember, there's been this great competition from the left, really ever since the 1960s, to shove aside the Jewish genocide, shove aside the genuine Nazis, and apply, as it were, the good and evil turns from that age to other groups. And one of the silliest attempts, of course, was pretending that slavery was genocide. And if you remember, I was hung, drawn, and quartered, and indeed would have been burned alive if the wretches could have got their hands on me for saying that it wasn't a genocide, and giving the illustration that it wasn't a genocide, because what is it? About 300,000, no more, slaves, black slaves, are sent to the 13 colonies. And I don't know how many blacks you've got in America now. If that's a genocide, how many million? Roughly how many millions? Blacks are what? 10%?
Yeah, no, maybe 13%. So call it 40 million.
40 million. I mean, in other words, just look at the scale. That's not a genocide, whatever else it might have been. So, and if you remember, also in that extraordinary summer where you had mostly peaceful riots, which burned down half the centres of the major cities of America, which here in Britain, at the height of COVID, when any form of public assembly was illegal, there were nevertheless indulged processions, which were so violent we had to board up the statue of Churchill. Churchill's statue is the man who is responsible for the international coalition that defeats Hitler, that defeats Germany, that defeats the Nazis, is daubed racist, and why I think it's peak woke. If you remember, it's also that summer that the notion of the Twitter cancellation central. That was how I was done. In those days, Twitter was politically uniform. It was dominated by the high left. It was dominated by all the groups that Charlie Kirk gave his life to arguing against and to bringing down. And the really interesting example, I think, if you remember, there was a great dispute over the editorials in the New York Times. And you had Barry Weiss, the comment editor, having commissioned a very innocuous article from the right, and every single one of her colleagues saying, this is outrageous, this is shocking, the article being pulled, a note from the editor saying, we made an awful mistake in allowing a possibly slight contrary opinion, and then writing that extraordinary open letter in which she said, this is Barry Weiss, whoever's name appears on the masthead of the editor of the New York Times, the real editor is Twitter. And, we found ourselves in that situation. The left had an instrument. It had an instrument that locked into the new media, and it used it with absolute ruthlessness to hold the whole public sphere. And this is why Trump has to go off and set up Truth Social and whatever. But of course, what happens 2 years later, I always regard it, Greg, as one of the great moments of history involving the kitchen sink. Elon Musk going into Twitter, carrying that kitchen sink. I think, I love the idea of physical objects in history. Being historians, we've got to give a fancy name for them. We call it material culture. But anyway, the 20th century and the whole disruption of good sense begins with another piece of white porcelain. And it begins in New York as well. It begins with Marcel Duchamp, taking in the urinal and proclaiming its art. And then it ends with the return of common sense. And it's very difficult to put the words common sense and Elon Musk together, but we can try. I think that's the beginning of the big sea change. That once you restore, again, Musk very conscious about these things, and also, interestingly, somebody else very conscious of his English ancestry, very, very conscious of the relationship of the Anglosphere to what we used to call the mother country. Musk deliberately saying, I have re-established what he calls the free marketplace of ideas, the centrality, again, with Charlie Kirk, of freedom of speech as the key issue in all of this. Of course, your First Amendment and those extraordinary rulings of the 1960s in your Supreme Court, which entrench it. And I think all of those things are now working themselves out. And what is the position, of course, is that Britain and America are at different stages of the electoral cycle response to that. But I mean, if you go back, and you'll confirm me if my memory is correct, people on this side of the Atlantic tend to think that the free speech absolutism of Elon Musk is the dominant American thread. It's not, is it? I mean, the Democrats. You had Tim Walz in one of the vice presidential debates actually saying he wants to remove First Amendment protections from hate speech. I mean, hate speech is invented in Berkeley. It's invented in the Berkeley Law School. In other words, that America, if Trump had not been elected, you would have had very, very much worse than Keir Starmer.
Yeah, look, I think, as much as there's a lot of criticism of the UK right now on free speech issues, if you go back only 4 and 5 years, you had the Biden campaign colluding with the media companies and the so-called 51 former intelligence officials, and then of course during COVID and the lockdowns and even into 2021, when the White House was colluding with social media to make sure the Great Barrington Declaration couldn't be published, it goes on and on. And I think you're right, David. Peak cancel culture was probably in 2020. I remember those days really well. Even my two children both called me and begged me not to comment on the George Floyd fentanyl overdose, as Charlie often referred to it. And he was right, because Charlie was honest. He wasn't afraid to say what was true. And so it of course annoyed the left constantly when he'd refer to the drug overdose of George Floyd. And I of course I refused. I think my children were just worried about me, but I did refuse, and I did go on the air. And the most important thing I try to do is not just answer the question, but correct the question.
In other words, the evidence.
Of course.
Both of us are interested in evidence. I mean, in this discussion so far, we haven't just been throwing abstract nouns around. What we've been trying to do is to relate it to specific instances, specific pieces of evidence, behavior of individuals, actual quotations of words. In other words, the proper debate.